I will live the rest of my life trying to prove to you that I'm sorry. And she said, I already know you're sorry. I don't need you to do that. I just need you to be my friend. And I said, I'm not doing it for you. And that's how I think about things. I'm not doing it for you. I'm doing it for me. And I know that if I think in my mind, if I ever lose the mindset that I have to prove to myself every day that I'm sorry, I'll forget and I'll start doing things that suggest that I'm not sorry. Sorry is an action word, Jim. It's nothing in today's society to say, oh, I'm sorry, and then to turn around and do it an hour later. I'm sorry. How many times can you say sorry before?
Well, one of the things we often would say, hey, I'm sorry. What's the big deal? I told you I was sorry.
Right.
How many times did you say that? How many times did you promise people?
I have no idea. None whatsoever. I can tell you this. I didn't tell that woman I was sorry for probably 4 years. And by the time I did tell her sorry, we had built a pretty good relationship, and it was Christmas Eve. So I figured I might get her better, her better side. She might not tell me where I can stick my sorry. And, that thinking didn't really come into play, but, I didn't get that side of her. She told me, she asked me what I was saying I was sorry for. And when I told her everything, she said, "Oh, I know."
Well, it sounds like you weren't a member of the Golden Rule Club either during these particular years. And there's many people out there, Will, who struggle with a whole lot of. And when we talk about addiction, it can be to anything. Okay, so in mine and yours particular case, it was drugs and alcohol that dominated our lives.
Right.
Could you share with a little bit of the people about that? We don't want to dive into all the horror stories. However, to qualify yourself just a bit.
Well, like I said, it started out pretty much drinking, and I smoked weed. I smoked weed up until the day I decided to change my life. Through all the other trials and tribulations that I ever tried, weed was my mainstay. I remember when I decided to change. There's always a question like, you know what I mean? Do you think that you can continue this in our world? It's called reservations, and I remember saying, if I don't know how I would handle something happen to one of my children, or if they ever legalize marijuana, I might be up a creek. And here we are. I don't know if it's 100% legal, but I'm pretty sure at this point it might as well be legal if it isn't. So, and I have no desire to journey down that rabbit hole. So,
okay. So when I talk to people outside of this arena and share my story with them, I just generally tell them to assume that I was altered most of the time.
Yes. It's funny because I tell these stories where, the jobs that I would get that I would hold for a little while, whenever I was high, like everybody just assumed that was me. It was when I wasn't high that everybody was like, dude, what is wrong with you? I must have been, very good. Speaking of my children's mother, who's, never had battles with drugs and alcohol whatsoever, except for, watching me during that time. And, she would get tired of dealing with me, and she'd be the one working and come home and hand me her hard-earned money and tell me, if you don't go get something and get out of my hair, so to speak, you're driving me crazy.
So you were miserable when you when you were on
Oh,
what we call enforced sobriety?
no, I was a bouquet of roses, Jim, at all times. Um, but eventually, it led into harder drugs,
Hmm.
and that's when, you know, um, it had started before. Me and her was having a lot of problems. Man, she was tired of the way that she was being treated, and we were just having a lot of problems. And I was looking for excuses to not be in the house. Looking back now, I believe a lot of that had to do with my son being born and not having a father and not understanding how to be a dad, and the fear that overwhelmed me, and I didn't know it at the time, because you couldn't even tell me I was scared of anything, let alone life. And that fear of being a dad to him, and like, what kind of a role model I was going to paralyzed me. And so I searched for reasons to get out of there, and eventually, like I said, it journeyed to pain pills, and then, cocaine became a real problem in my life, and it went on to heroin, and heroin didn't stick around too much because it scared the living daylights out of me. But the pain pills that I was doing were harder than heroin. I just didn't know it because at least it's not heroin.
Well, you justified that in your own
Right.
mind, of course.
So those were the things that I told myself. But needless to say, my life had gotten just as bad as anybody else doing anything that comes down.
Well, I think this is this is a good point to tell people out there, because when we get trapped in that cycle of addiction, we deal with guilt, remorse, and shame every single day. And other people out there are thinking, well, they can stop if they want to. They're worthless. But they don't understand that horrible nightmare of existence.
Jim, I think from my own personal experiences, um, it doesn't matter what we do. It's all over feelings. It's all over emotions. It's all over inadequacy. It's all over low self-esteem. You know, anytime we consistently make bad choices and try to avoid life, it's been my experience that it's always about feelings, and it's never about a certain substance. Um, we just gravitate to certain substances that might, you know, make us feel a certain way to the point where it takes over, to the point where we say that that's our one thing, but it's really just the one that's got a hold of us.
Well, what we do is, when I speak at a lot of rehabs, and what I tell people is, I said, you know what, the drugs and alcohol, whatever, they're symptoms. Okay, so what we try to do is try to find out what drives behavior. What drives that behavior? It's like getting rid of drugs and alcohol are like blowing smoke out the first floor window when the basement's on fire. Okay. And we often say, oh, gee, if Johnny would just stop drinking, oh my gosh, Harvard's awaiting him. Or if Mary would just stop using drugs, she'll be the queen of industry. But that's not true.
Well, I think the problem for a lot of people like me and you, Jim, is there's always one exception. There's always one exception. There is always that guy who like has his bouts with crack cocaine, and he quits that and he drinks, and he's not really that bad of a drinker, and all of a sudden people like me and you see that, and we're like, "Oh, well, we can be him." And chances are we're not him. Chances are we're me and you. And I think that gets a lot of people caught up, and it gets a lot of people to not try a different way of life. And
So, what we're hoping to do tonight, Will, is there's maybe people that listen to this podcast, maybe listening right now, that are saying, man, I wish I could stop. Because I'll tell you what, Will, every day I said to myself, I'm not using today. At one point during the day, I'm not using today.
it's a great point, Jim, and I ultimately believe that the exception to the rule, the alcoholic, the drug addict, the overeater, the gambler, it all starts and ends with people, places, and things. No matter how you change your way of life, it all starts with making sure you don't put yourself in the same positions.
Exactly correct. And sometimes, Will, and we've talked about this on our program before a number of times, is that my counseling firm, Namaste Holistic Counseling, when we talk about holistic, there's three things that make a flower bloom. Okay. Water, sunlight, and soil. And I refer to uh, the program that I'm involved in, 12 step for behavioral change, is that water is taking care of your physical body. Very important. The sun we consider the sunlight of the spirit, a spiritual connection with something. Doesn't have to have a name. And then the environment, the soil, is the people, places, and things that we surround ourselves
Absolutely.
with. If you take a beautiful flower, Will, and you transplant it into a sandbox, what happens?
Well, it's not going to bloom.
Mm-hmm.
You know, the saying that resonates with me is, if you lay with dogs long enough, you're going to catch fleas. And that I've heard the barbershop one, but
Sure.
given my certain circumstances, the barbershop one doesn't resonate with me, since I've been having to shave my own bald head for the better part of 20 years now. But the one that says, if you lay down with dogs, you're bound to catch fleas, that one resonates with me.
Well, sometimes people can't see that. There's a saying that we use, and saying that you can't read the label when you're inside the bottle. Okay. That goes for drug and alcohol addiction. That goes for
Yes.
anxiety and depression, and particularly relationships.
It's hard to see the big picture when you're part of the frame.
Yes. Yeah, it is.
And that was me for the longest time. For the longest time, it was, it was hard to see the big picture. But I believe in my heart, Jim, I always wanted to be the dad that my dad never was. And, and I think the turning point in my life was, getting arrested for selling drugs and knowing that I was going to have to tell them little people goodbye. For some reason, it broke my spirit,
Mm.
and it hit me harder than I think I ever imagined. And I don't know, and and I'm not the most religious guy in the world, Jim, but I remember distinctly, screaming out night after night because suicide had become a viable option,
Mm-hmm.
because I didn't want to live like that no more. And I remember for the better part of 2 weeks, and I prayed every night to this thing that I didn't believe in. And I was asking for help, and it was like, even if you got to take my life, because I tried, and I don't really have the kahunas to go through with this.
Yeah.
But if you could so find it in your heart to either give me something or take my life, that would be great. And
So it sounded like you had what we often, for anything, I often wish the people the gift of desperation.
yes, I remember when I went, 2 weeks later, when I got a very distinct knock at the door. That knock we get at the door. We know who's on the other end. I remember when I got that very distinct knock and walking outside and in the handcuffs. I remember looking up at this pretty blue sky and thinking to myself, "Thank you." And but the pain that came with knowing that I was going to have to tell my kids goodbye was something I didn't expect. And it was brutal, Jim. It was brutal, but um, I remember telling my son, like, I'll never tell you goodbye again. And I don't know that that was the greatest thing to tell him. Because what did we talk about in the beginning of the show? How many times did we say I'm sorry? And I don't know what made me do it, but I promised him I would never tell him goodbye again, and I've never told him goodbye again.
So sometimes when we look at these incidents, I remember my own moment of clarity myself, and sometimes we think that was a horrible day. People will come to me, maybe breaking down, crying. They have their parents or their loved ones with them, and maybe I assist them in getting into some type of treatment and getting some help, and they think this is the worst day of my life. And later on, we sit and talk about that, and I'll say, you know what, you may have thought that was the best of your day of your life. I thought the worst day of your life. I thought it was the best day you ever had.
But that's that clarity.
Yeah.
I remember this time, and I don't know if you do or not, but I think it was my third day in a treatment facility, and you happened to come into that facility, and I remember you looking at me, and it's not very like you to like look at somebody like, when are you going to do something different? But you did. I remember you looking at me like, when? In frustration. And I've never seen you frustrated like that. And there was probably a moment in my life where that would have been an insult. And I remember taking it with a lot of heartfelt that you cared about me.
Indeed.
And you were frustrated because you knew that there was something better in me. And so I think the point in all this is, if you're out there and you're listening and you think like there's no way, like there is. There's definitely a way. It's hard work. It takes, like we were talking in the beginning, it takes to be okay with not being the popular guy. It takes okay with having to make decisions that isn't made, always the popular decision. It takes sometimes standing in a room full of people who say they're spiritual people, and having to pull them back or stand alone at times, because we're all humans, and it's one of the hardest times to stand alone is when you're standing amongst your peers and amongst people who believe they're already living a better life. So it's really hard sometimes to get through to somebody who already believes that they're doing everything right.
Well, what we're saying is that we want to be with our tribe. We need to be with like-minded people. We need to be with people who aren't going to ask us why we did things, because they know.
Right.
Okay. And they're going to say, I don't care what you did. Here's what I did about it. So there you were, leaving your house in handcuffs. The police obviously had no sense of humor about whatever you were doing. And
no, they actually did. Because I remember the arresting officer, may he rest in peace. At 18 years old, when I first moved from Baltimore, I was a wild child, and I had robbed the local Dairy Queen in our area. And he was the guy who prosecuted us in court. And we ended up not beating the charges, but we ended up getting off. And he was so mad. And he jacked me up leaving the courtroom. And he had a lisp. So when he talked, he kind of spit.
Okay.
And he spit all over me. And I remember wiping it off my face and grabbing his hands from clutching me in the courtroom and like slinging his hands back and telling him, don't you ever put your hands on me again. And he was the arresting officer like 20 years later. And he said, I told you I'm going to get you. And he, and he was happy. He was very happy. And little did he know that I was going to go through a change in life. And about 5.5 years later, he was sitting in his car outside of my mom's house. And he hadn't seen me prior to the arrest. And I remember knocking on the window, and he must have not have recognized me at first since it had been some time. And he rolled down the window, and when anytime a cop's approach, it's probably a nerve-wracking scene for them. And he said, "Can I help you?" And I said, "I just wanted to let you know that, I wanted to tell you thank you, that you changed my life." And he looked up at me and he said, "Will?" And I said, "Yeah." And he said, "Oh my God." And so he went to get out the car. And as he went to get out of his car, he dips his head down. But by the time his head had resurfaced and he was out of his car, there was tears flowing down his eyes. And, and he had told me, "Thank you," because I had, I was the reason why he did what he did, because he was trying to affect people's lives in a positive manner, not in a negative, the way the police are viewed. And I believe in my heart that's what we do.
Please check out our website at fishingwithoutbait.com, where you can listen to the show, comment on our discussions, and find out where you can subscribe to our podcast. If you're interested in flying the colors of Fishing Without Bait, click the shop icon on our website. We have clothing, mugs, cell phone cases, and so much more. Show the world that you fish without bait. This show is a member of the Sorgatron Media Podcast Network. Find out more at sorgatronmedia.com.